Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from Global Net 21 and Enfield Climate Action Forum, and this is one of the many webinars today. And today we've got Caroline Pakel with us. Now, Caroline is a trained coach, and she deals with a lot of issues: nonviolent communication, transactional analysis, conflict resolution, and a lot more, which she'll tell us about. But she's also very knowledgeable on how you make contact with people who are influenced or have power and how you should approach them. And she's going to share her experiences with us about that today. So welcome, Caroline. And can I ask you, first of all, to tell us very briefly something about yourself and your background?
Well, hello, Francis, and thank you for this warm welcome. What's important for me to say about my background? I guess the first thing to say is I've always been a foreigner. I've always been an outsider. I'm half French, half German from background. I'm British too, thanks to Brexit. And I've traveled around the world, run cross-cultural studies as a researcher to start with, and then moved into innovations. I've worked for some of the biggest names, international names in business. Some I'm proud of and some I'm not. Some of the work that you do in marketing is sometimes kind of questionable, I would say, which I no longer do. And then I developed coaching, mentoring, and I got passionate about dialogue. For the last 15 years, I have been researching, experimenting, learning from anywhere that mentioned dialogue, literally. Made me become a Quaker as a result of one of the things that happened for me. What else? I am a mother. And I think that's probably been one of the most important experiences of my life. And I think that's important in terms of considering where I went with activism and such, which I can talk about. And I love nature. I have a relationship with nature that is very visceral. That's the way to describe it today. And I live on the Isle of Wight today, which I see now as my deep adaptation process, kind of learning to live a simple life.
Okay, so you have you have a relationship with these, but you also sort of have a relationship with people in power. You worked a great deal with influencing them, MPs, for example. I mean, do you think generally many of us have a problem when we approach MPs and we maybe do it in the wrong way?
So let me go back to what's happened for me for the last 5 years. After having done all that I did, becoming a specialist of people in terms of, I'm a psychologist, a so-called social psychologist from background too. I joined Extinction Rebellion nearly 4 years ago now. And I was attracted by Extinction Rebellion because I was at the stage of my life where I needed change. I wanted to be part of the change that was needed for nature, for us to be able to survive. But also I saw them doing dialogue in the street. So I saw them running people's assemblies, which are literally a dialogic process, with anyone. And I think that to me is the ultimate challenge, is how do we all bring together everyone around the planet? So whether they are people of influence or not. But I ended up sitting on political circle for a while, not really understanding any of the things they were talking about, to be quite honest, because I had no interest in politics at the time. And then someone mentioned that we weren't really influencing the conservative field. And I thought, and that really tickled me immediately, because I thought, oh, I've got all this background about running motivational research and influencing people. And that surely I could do the same with people, who have influence. It doesn't really matter who they are. I've been working with boards of really large companies. I really wasn't really daunted by the prospect. The point is that I didn't really have any connections. I didn't really know anyone like important or famous, in that sense. But I had two friends, so I wrote to my two friends, and they sent me back a long list of potential leads, and that's how it started. And we called it XR Catalyzers. So we created this subgroup within political circle, within Extinction Rebellion, in a very discreet manner, because in some ways, for some of the more radical activists, we were talking to the enemy, and that was not necessarily acceptable. But we believed in bringing dialogue to people in places of power and influence. That was our mandate. And we experimented with different formulas in a way running conversations and having meetings the way they were used to. So we within 2 months we were invited to Chatham House, for instance. And Chatham House is a really kind of prestigious place where people meet. Very, I mean, we had previous ministers, talking. We had a panel. We had one of us on the panel, but we were running around this little room with lots of big people, CEOs and all rest, in our little suit and with our little badge on. And I was saying to the guys, what are we disrupting here? What are we changing? It's not making any difference. That's what they're comfortable with. So that's where the idea of the fire circle came up, in a way, taking them out of their comfort zone, in that we would allow them to be who they are in a place of trust and respect, and being able to really reconnect to how they were feeling. Because what we identified immediately when it came to anyone really, but especially in places of power and influence, is this need to stay in their heads, because that's protective. If you stay with facts and figures and rational reasons, then you don't need to change anything. You can trust, and you can say, oh, but there's technology development coming and all sorts of things. So I guess for 3 years we ran fire circles, we ran dialogic conversations. This is why I brought the fire circle is a dialogic process. It's nothing. It's no miracle about it, but it requires quite a lot of courage to take part in a circle like that, and being yourself and bringing your feelings into it.
Can I ask you, I mean, you said you need to get the MP outside of their comfort zone. Did you have to get yourself and your colleagues outside of your comfort zone as well? I mean, you talk about in your website of moving from being stuck to being unstuck. Did you have to get unstuck as well?
Oh, that's a lovely question. I don't think I've had that one before. I think I started my own journey about 15 years ago, and I don't see myself stuck anymore, or broken, or all the words that you might describe, because that's part of my journey, my personal journey. So when I met my colleagues, I invited actually the people who became my colleagues within XR Catalyzers, and none of them had experiences as facilitators, which I had. I had been facilitating and holding space for groups for lots of different reasons for 30 years at the time. So I realized that these were the gifts I was bringing, is this experience I could share. And so I trained them and I shared. So that was really uncomfortable for them. And we talked about it, holding space, bringing the whole of who they are, being non-judgmental, even with people that you might have views about, which might be negative. So was I ever outside my comfort zone? Actually, I would say the opposite, Francis. I realized for the first time in my life, I was on purpose. So the 4 years I spent with Extinction Rebellion, and ever since, actually, for the last 5 years, I can say I have been completely on purpose, following my personal values, completely aligned with whoever I am, completely aligned with whatever I do.
Yeah, but you're a confident person, and a lot of people who are going to make contact with people in power maybe don't have that self-confidence. So, I mean, what would you say to them? I mean, do they have to create self-awareness for themselves first, and then awareness of the other person, so they're talking to people and not someone in power?
So this is interesting. I don't see myself as a self-confident person in per se. I would say confidence comes from an acceptance of one's goodness and darkness. And that's the process I went through. And I think there's a lot of humility and vulnerability that comes into being who you are completely. So there may be questions where I would be very vulnerable, and I'd be very happy to do so. So I think there's something about self-acceptance, self-care, self-love, which then translates into how you deal with other people. So for me, talking to these people in places of power and influence, I never really wanted to know who they were, because that really didn't matter when they came to fire circles, when they were invited by others. When we had dialogic conversations, I knew who they were, and it really didn't matter to me. for me, was more important about approaching them as human beings and encouraging them to bring the whole of who they were. So if I was going to get impressed, by their status or by their biography, then that wasn't going to happen. So I don't think it's about confidence. It's about respect. We always approach everyone with kindness and respect. However, we really enacted the first demand of Extinction Rebellion, which was about telling the truth. And telling the truth is always painful. It's unless you're, the truth, the real truth, complete truth. There's always some really goodness, some affirmation, some praise that you can include in the truth. But there's always the dark side. I think that kind of reflects, the how we relate with one another. It's just acknowledging that no one is perfect and we are all vulnerable, whether we have not that much power or influence. It really makes no difference. I found most of the people we talk to in a very vulnerable place, quite trapped in their own power, unaware of the fact that they had power. So I think it was quite liberating for them to have these conversations with us.
But you did say, for example, in XR, you suddenly realized, or some of your colleagues realized, they're talking to the enemy. And in a way, in Britain, we have an adversarial culture of politics, which is about condemnation. How important is it to perhaps get in your mind that what you're doing is not about winning in the first place, it's about solving problems?
So I think you need to go back to more of I would call it the old paradigm and the new paradigm. And for me, the old paradigm is about individualism and competition, which is very much, what capitalistic systems have kind of created for us. And you may have a creative problem-solving mindset, but it may be orientated towards your self-gain, I would say, which people in power, the more power you have, the more power you want. It's a bit like money, it's complete addiction. And unless you have a sense of wisdom, or you have developed a sense of awareness that took you to a place of wisdom, then you're likely to misuse power or use it for personal reasons, as we're witnessing, in many political circles these days, how people kind of support their friends, and which, when you think about it, the old ways of being in tribes and clans, kind of makes sense, or old men's clubs, I call them now too as well. There's lots of issues that come into place. So yes, politics may be based on condemnation. It's based on blame and shame. And I loved Extinction Rebellion because one of the rules and principles was we won't blame or shame any individual. And that really required a lot of practice. That really was really challenging. And we kind of kept reminding one another about it. So when we were talking to people, we talked to oil majors to the highest level. So when you're talking to someone who is involved in causing and has caused, is being part of causing a lot of harm around the world, you really need to work on the fact that we're condemning is not going to change anything. Where I got to, Francis, is if we're going to change anything, we're going to have to do it all together. And that is going to involve a lot of forgiveness. And obviously that's going to take a while. It's going to take a lot of work from each of us, because we all have our own personal histories in terms of legacies of harm caused to us, and we each have to deal with it.
But that's having that understanding on both sides, isn't it? Both of the person who's trying to influence your group, or you, or whoever is trying to do the influencing. There's a sort of has to be a degree of humility in it and understanding when you do it. It's quite interesting. You have on your website, right on the front page, a quote from St. Francis of Assisi, which says, "Start by doing what is necessary, then what is possible, and suddenly you're doing the impossible." So many people start, don't they, with the impossible?
Yes. And so what's necessary? So I love St. Francis. I love Franciscan contemplation. That's probably one of the sources of nourishment for me these days. So what's necessary? So I want to go back to understanding from both sides. It's quite clear that the dialogic process brings a deep listening practice. And that's something I get people to practice before every meeting I run these days. And by listening to one another without interrupting each other, then we get to a place where we finally hear each other's story. And that was the principle of the fire circle. There would be a place where we would start really relearning to listen, because people in power and influence are just used just to give orders, instructions. They're not so good at listening to what they need to be hearing, as opposed to seeking what they want to hear, you know? So listening to each other's stories then creates something where, if we were to use a dialogic process in this conversation, then I would hear your story, Francis, and I would say, oh, yes, me too. Oh, yes. Oh, that's completely different from what I've lived. And that's so interesting. So that would start creating bonds, bridges between us that are quite indestructible in my experience. And after 2 or 3 hours of this, there would be something emerging between us and say, oh, could we not do something together in this way or for this? There would be something that would come up and say, oh, it sounds like we might be able to continue the journey together in this way. And this is what the fire circle we witness could do for people in places of power influence, is connecting them to a place where they could recognize their own respective vulnerability. So being weak is actually the source of our strength, if we look into weaknesses, and weaknesses being in terms of fear. So that's the main weakness that I would talk about here. Is we all fearful of the future, if we're being honest about it, and people in places of power are not really allowed, or weren't allowed for quite a long time, to recognize their own fears or admit them, you know. So having a place where you can do that creates a bond further beyond understanding, for me personally. So what was necessary was simply to acknowledge our vulnerability. That was necessary for all of us to sit together and recognize that we really fucked it up. I apologize, but we've really messed it up really badly, and that what is possible is that we are all human. So we know we can learn to trust one another if we approach each other with kindness and respect. And what is possible, because we have all these means, is for us to sit together and try to learn new ways of being together. I really believe we've never been in this situation before. All my research and I've looked at all the mediation programs, conflict resolution programs that we've been used throughout the world and throughout our recent history. They've always been short term. Nothing's ever lasted in terms of us remaining together. So we've got this tremendous opportunity, which seems impossible. Can you imagine the oneness around the world? One nation, one earth, one nation. This just seems like impossible. But I think that's what life is asking us to consider moving forward.
So you go in to meet a politician, not you, but someone who's probably not had the experience you've had. And they see this politician behind a desk, maybe in a suit if he's a man, well-dressed if she's a woman, staff around them, and they look quite intimidating. How do you get to exchange your vulnerabilities?
So it's about sharing experiences. It's not about, so the dialogic process is basically, the essence of dialogue is openness and sharing our feelings and experiences. So you have to model this. So we always model. There was always 2 of us in any dialogic conversations, and I would use, or I'd invite the other person with me to model this openness and vulnerability, which sets the tone to a conversation. I would never sit with someone behind a desk because the desk is already an obstacle. So, and it's really protective to sit behind a desk. So I'd invite them to sit somewhere else. I'd actually say, could we please sit in that corner? I would never sit in a place where people are being observed, or they have to stick to that posture of, it's like a regal posture, isn't it, when you have people around you and serving you and taking care of you. It was always intimate, in that all the conversations we run were in confidence. So they were either in discrete places where people were alone. So it was easy. I'll always remember there was very, very, very senior person in central banking. That's how I would refer to him. And my friend, my colleague, didn't show up because he was living off grid and couldn't connect on the time agreed. And this person was on the call with all his team, very, very senior. And I thought, God, how am I going to run this conversation? I know really not that much about central banking, not that I'm particularly interested in it, but I understand the architecture and the issues. So that's probably good enough. And all I did is start talking about what I'd just been doing as a person. And I said, oh, isn't it amazing? Lovely weather. I said, I'm actually starting to learn to grow tomatoes. And I've just been looking at them and I've been really mesmerized by how they're growing at the moment. And that person on the other side, in front of his team, immediately said, oh, yes, me too. I'm growing tomatoes on my balcony in London. And that's created the first connection, the first human connection for us to have an open, trusting conversation, believe it or not. And my friend then joined the call, so we could then move the conversation to some of the issues we wanted to discuss with that person and his team.
I mean, that's quite interesting, the tomato method, which, I mean, it sounds funny, but it's really quite an interesting one because you're actually talking to someone outside of their profession. You're actually engaging with them, and that's interesting. But what you're talking about, developing a process of dialogue. But, you know, if someone is first contacting an MP, they go to their office, they write to them, they meet them at a meeting and they want to influence them at that point, how can they do it then? Because they can't develop that whole process that you're doing. Yes. They have to start there. What do they do?
The first thing is they need to work on themselves in terms of how they're judging that person. They're probably bringing a lot of anger or a lot of bitterness and resentment. That's my suspicions. And you just got to go and I think of Steve Baker. I run a little group in the Chilterns when I used to live in Buckinghamshire, and I was one of his constituents. I think it was about 2.5 years ago now, and I requested a meeting to discuss the CE bill because we wanted him to support it. That was our point of entry.
The CE bill.
I should say it's the environmental bill. I think it's changed name. That's been trying to be pushed through Parliament, which is now supported by quite a large number of MPs. You know, so it's kind of that was a process that took a while, but it's really taking off now, which is amazing. And so I invited Steve Baker. Steve Baker is quite a difficult person, I would say, because he's a Christian and he's, you know, supposedly a good person. He is a good person. However, he's probably one of the strongest climate denialists that we have in politics at the moment. It's not the only one. We've got quite a few. And I invited him immediately to, was it interested in running an XR catalyzer conversation? He said, and they always say yes, because they say, oh, that sounds interesting. You know, and so we checked in. There's a checking in. So we model that and how we arriving to this meeting and how we feeling. So that's how we introduce the feeling bit. Yeah, you have to have the courage to do that. And I think because you do it with kindness and respect and assertiveness, I guess, you know, you have to move in with trusting the process. That's really important, is trusting that process. Then we got to a place where Steve Baker admitted that he'd never read any of the IPCC reports, you know. And we asked him, would he meet again and would he read at least one of the reports so we could discuss it again with him? Which he said he would, which he didn't in the end. But what I want to say is, how do you approach these people? Is like, first of all, you need to approach them with tolerance and acceptance. If you're approaching them with hatred or resentment or anger, it's only going to kind of fuel more conflict because you're going to slip at some point. It's going to show in your tone, in the way you're approaching that person. So, and once you're there, it's inviting them to be truly who they are, like the whole of who they are. So, at some point, I remember Steve saying, "Oh, you could nearly trigger me here, Caroline." So it's like acknowledging that he's getting, you know, stirred by some of the things that we were talking about. And I say, well, I'm sorry, don't mean to, but it is disruptive. So kind of explaining the process, that the process of being yourself and bringing the whole of who we are is disruptive because we're not used to it anymore. you know.
But how do you continue that? I mean, you talk to Steve Baker. I mean, suppose you got him to agree on some aspect of what you want, and
Yes.
he's very nice and so on. But then he goes back and he meets his mates, and his original prejudice are reinforced. How do you follow up? How do you make sure you get through to them in the long run?
Yeah, in the long run, it's interesting because I moved from Buckinghamshire, but since we've got Steve Baker Watch that emerged with key members of the initial group running this, and he's that seems to have influenced him a lot, because it's been very provocative. So they did a Christian prayer session. He's a Christian, so they went and prayed, in front of his office. They stood to invite him to woods where they are, as a group. How do you follow up is you have to keep persisting from a place of respect, and you have to keep seeking ways to connect with that person. So Christianity was one of the routes that was chosen, to continue some form of connection with Steve Baker. So it's a long-term relationship that you're trying to build, and you keep at it. So you could use other forms of connections. I think I can't remember what it's called now, but he's a member of a research group which is at the essence of fueling,
Yes. ECG.
Yes, exactly. And that's a bit more difficult, and I think you need to then I would say target, but target is the wrong word really, is to engage with every single member of that group in order to help them change. And I think that's probably the impossible. I'll be honest with you. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it's a waste of time personally. I think where we need to start growing alliances and this sense of new togetherness is with people who are doubting, and it's like the whistleblowers who they want to come out really. So it's helping those, and that's what the catalyzers did, is running conversations with people who wanted to talk to us, and in a way it was testing themselves, testing their own beliefs, testing what they'd done, because we would be challenging, we would be quite provocative in some of the things we would say, because that's what truth is, when we look at the situation that we're in. We've all done bad things. I've been part of programs, marketing programs, absolutely useless and absolutely not needed. It's like, how do you develop the next purple cookie? Was the phrase that we kind of came to, like, who needs purple cookies? But that's the situation we're in. So if I was, so first of all, it's not for everyone to be able to approach these people in this way. If you don't have any experience in relating with people in places, in relating to others in disruptive manner, I would say, or like with the intention to disrupt, with the intention to bring change. So that is really a specific intention that you need to consider. I've done quite a lot of training, by the way, Francis.
That's interesting what you just said, that you have to do it in a particular way. I mean, some people write to MPs, they get very aggressive, they do 10 pages that the MP is expected to read. Is, people who do the engagement, is it something everyone can do, or do you need special skills, or even do you have to have a certain aptitude?
I think you've got some principles of engagement that you abide by. And as I keep saying, for me, the first one is respect and kindness. And then truth-telling. And then you need to watch the language you use. So it's really understanding how we impact one another with some of the words we use, and how we can trigger each other, unknowingly. This is the thing, and that's why it's quite challenging. But I think from a place of truth-telling, in the context of kindness and respect, then our shared humanity emerges. As I can bet, I can predict it. That's the essence of what we did, really, because then we can share our stories, our respective stories of what went wrong and how our regrets and how we might consider changing it, or how we're looking for ways to change it. We talked to people who just left the cabinet in the last year, and it was quite clear that they had learned so much, from all the different positions they'd held. And it's quite clear that they wanted to be part of the change. They were seeking their own way of being part of the change. I would say it's easy to talk to anyone, provided that you don't judge them and that you accept that you've made mistakes too. So they've made mistakes too. Everyone's making mistakes, and that maybe by sharing respective experiences and stories, we might influence one another towards positive change. And I have another really good story around that, if you want one.
Okay, go on.
So I run a fire circle in the city with senior representatives of all the financial sectors, pensions, investments, and all. I just this is why I don't go into the details in terms of names. And I had a very senior person who came towards the end and thanked me for sharing a very simple story. After I joined Extinction Rebellion, April Rebellion, I closed my company, my little consultancy. I just knew I couldn't carry on in this way. So I've always continued my coaching, but the marketing bit just went. unless the projects would help protect and repair the planet. And that's the phrase that came up. And then I stopped flying after October Rebellion. So November 19, I decided to stop flying. I've been flying all my life for work, for professional reasons, all my life. So that really was cutting probably the main sources of revenue for me in some ways. And then I got tested immediately. January 20, I got an invitation from a very big luxury brand saying, "Oh, please, will you go back to New York and run this project for us? That was wonderful what you did. We'd love to do it again." And I wrote to them and said, "Oh, yes, that was a great project. It was supposed to be about sustainability, but really it wasn't." I said, "Will it will this one help protect or repair the planet? Because I'm not flying anymore for environmental reasons, but I would consider it if this project will help protect and repair the planet." And the response I got was unlikely. I liked the honesty of the response, and I knew I had disrupted and stirred whoever was on the other side. And I share this story often in fire circles with people in places of power and influence. And this guy at the end of the fire circle in the city came around and thanked me. And he said, what I really the main takeaway is this, what you shared. And he said, this thing about what I want to be doing now, moving back into my office, is asking myself, for every decision I make, will this help protect and repair the planet? And I thought, well, that's bingo for me. I thought, I've been honest in my vulnerability, in my insecurity, financial insecurity I was bringing to my life, difficult decisions. And in that, I'm helping somebody else progress or, bring awareness to the decisions they're making in that place of power and influence.
I mean, you use the word, and it's used a lot nowadays, disruption. That's an important concept, isn't it? And it isn't about making people uncomfortable in a very negative way, is it? It's about disrupting the way we think about things, and it could disrupt ourselves as well. Disruption is a very positive thing. It's not destruction, is it?
No, it's always the danger, isn't it? And the fear of destruction when you talk about disruption. So we think about life. We always want a comfort, security, and we like to stick to our little habits. That's how most of us are. That's just the behavioral, economics way, if you want to look into it. However, we know that progress, so innovation talks about disruption. A lot in the world of innovation, for instance, and there's different types of disruptions. We won't go into that, but that's the concept of changing the continuity of what is. literally. That's what a disruption is. And in that change, all of us don't want change. All of us want things to remain the way they are. Most of us, I should rephrase this. Most of us in comfortable places in the Western world in particular, with enough money to survive and be okay with everything, don't want things to change. So the more money you have, the more you don't want things to change. Because, you're powerful, you can do things. Why would you change? And I'm thinking about the 1% that we need to influence and change in terms of lifestyle, because they're causing so much harm around the world because of that lifestyle. So disruption is not welcome by most people, in principle, because it's going to take them out of their comfortable habitual life, which is fulfilling. Well, it's not necessarily fulfilling them, but meeting what they see as their wants and needs at that time. Yeah.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, okay. No, I was going to say we've sort of gone past that half hour, which is great because we could go on forever. But let's sort of sum up. I mean, if anybody wanted to continue to think about how they approach influential people, is there any way they can go for help?
I'm happy to talk to them. A lot of people reach out, and I think I'm going to start. It's been coming up for the last couple of months. I'm going to write a little manual. We did write a manual for the fire circle, which is a little too sophisticated, I would say, for people who just want to approach others. There's lots of things I don't know. That's the answer, Francis. Where would I tell people? I would tell people to find their own way within their own heart in terms of how to approach people, because the rules are still the same. It's about tolerance, acceptance, forgiveness, and approaching people from a place of kindness and respect, and telling the truth. So being quite focused and no blame and shame. So being focused on what you need from that person. And we were always clear when we approached people in places of power and influence, what we needed for that. So we got a change from Steve Baker. Steve Baker actually helped extend, it was one of the governmental measures towards some of the support for heat pumps, I think at the time, that was extended by 6 months. And that's what and he helped with us. We don't take credit for it, but we know there was a kind of sequence, so that was a little thing. Whether we helped him change, we maybe have got him to look at IPCC reports, who knows, at this stage. But you've got to be quite clear about what you need and you can't aim for the impossible. You need to look at what could they change now that is simple, the low-hanging fruits in that way. If you go back to the quote that we looked at. So what's necessary, what's really important right now that was going to make change, and then progress from there, and be courageous. And nurture courage.
And be courageous, yeah. I mean, that's important. Okay, so you said they could contact you. How would they contact you? I know you've got a website.
They can send me an email at caroline.pakel, Pakel, at protonmail.com. Protonmail is protonmail.com.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Caroline, for doing that, because I think all that's really interesting. And I mean, I think a lot of people do approach MPs, people in power, councillors as well, often in a more adversarial and aggressive way sometimes. And that comes from our own insecurities as much as anything else. Yeah. And I think you've actually helped people a lot. And so we'll make sure this webinar is well disseminated on YouTube and social networks, because I think people will find it very useful, and it will make them think, it will disrupt their way of doing things in a positive way. So I think it's been a very valuable, experiential webinar that people, I think, will learn a lot from. So thank you for doing it, Caroline.
You're most welcome.
Okay, well, thank you. And we'll stop this webinar now.